information. Sorry about that. So I have embedded the rubric that I was using that was on the assignment into the assignment in Canvas, and that's what I'm going to be using to leave feedback. I'm also going to be highlighting on the text itself, which is going to be, if you go to the submission and rubric, once it's graded, you can see where I highlighted specific areas that I want you to work on as needed. So I'm struggling to keep up on grading, folks. I'm kind of burned out at the moment. A lot of teachers are really struggling right now, and I know students are as well. So please be patient with me. I'm going to try to get through these in the next several days, and then we can go through the revision process as needed. But again, I've kind of hit a wall, so that's where we are with that. Okay, so a couple things we're going to do today. We're going to briefly talk about the letter assignment from Friday. We're not going to go over the questions, but I do want to talk about the general tone that we see in each letter from Hamilton and Jefferson towards each other in writing to Washington. We're going to talk briefly about the Whiskey Rebellion, and we're going to talk about the election of 1792 and what that means with regards to what's going to happen next. So in terms of the next election, because we saw the first one happen. The second one's a little bit different in terms of, what does Washington want to serve again? Does he have a desire to do that? And we'll talk about it. So go into notability. Again, I'm still missing, as of this morning, about half of these assignments from last week. So we need to get those done as soon as possible. I'm not going to go over the questions. I'm going to go over just talking about the tone of the letters here and what we kind of have already discussed. So if you have any questions about something, we can discuss it. But I'm just curious. So you read these two letters. They're both written by members of Washington's cabinet to him on the same day. And by this point, the divide between Jefferson and Hamilton is very much present. It's not as if we're building up to that. I mean, the two men are having real difficulties working together. And it's a very difficult situation for Washington, especially because here is his cabinet, which is supposed to be a group of advisors to help him, that are really causing him more problems, especially considering that he is the first president and he's still trying to figure his way around the role that he's supposed to be playing. So if somebody would please put your hand raising icon up and tell me which letter you found to be more explosive or more fiery and why. Eileen, what do you think?
I think Jefferson's was a little bit more vindictive, maybe.
And what is there anything in there specifically that stood out to you?
I think especially in that paragraph, when he says that history may not even stoop to notice Hamilton, is a little bit much more vindictive than Hamilton's letter, because Hamilton kind of skirts around his accusations almost, or like covers them up with like nice euphemisms, whereas Jefferson is just kind of like, well, like I'm not going to do this if you let Hamilton to keep doing this, and like, yeah.
I think it's well said, and I think this right here is the paragraph that I think says it all. The fact that if history even stoops low enough to notice him, I think that is a very, very explosive statement to make about a position, someone of Hamilton's status. And I did mistakenly mention, I should have remembered this. Washington or Hamilton addresses Jefferson straightforward, and it's not until the very end of the speech that we even see the word Hamilton mentioned in Jefferson's letter. But if something is very slanderous, in a lot of ways, it's something where a person who accuses someone of being slanderous feels that their personal integrity is being attacked. And I think it's clear here that Jefferson feels that way from Hamilton. But I think in the long run, what Jefferson's trying to say is that I think he's aiming his frustration. He's aiming his frustration about the fact that Jefferson feels he's not being listened to by Washington, or maybe Jefferson's suggestions are being overlooked by Washington. Because again, the difficulty that Washington faces is that Jefferson and Hamilton have a very different outlook on the role of the federal government. Okay. If you go back to what we discussed a little bit already last week, Jefferson and Hamilton's perspective on government, see if I can pull this up real quick, goes back to this sense of, okay, we have these two men who for a long time have kind of had these feelings about the role of government, and the fact that these two men are supposed to be, whoops, that's not even the right one, sorry, are supposed to be working hand in hand in a cabinet. It's almost like today, if you had, let's say you had Donald Trump as president and he had a Republican and a Democrat that were very polar opposite in terms of political opinion, working in the same cabinet and trying to get along. So with Washington, the fact that Hamilton and Jefferson think very differently about the role of the federal government, and Jefferson especially is concerned about the role of the federal government getting bigger, and that has to be, these two men are working in this cabinet, has to be very difficult for Washington. And for Jefferson, it's frustrating because Washington is going to tend to side much more with Hamilton than with Jefferson on a lot of issues. And again, that goes back to why historians look back and label Washington as a Federalist, even though he didn't identify himself by party. It's very clear that that's the way that, he envisions, he's siding with Hamilton much more in those circumstances than he would be with Jefferson. And obviously that makes Jefferson upset. And I think it's very obvious that would be the case. And again, one of the things that I think is interesting in the first letter from Hamilton is that, he starts out by apologizing for the fact that this situation, this rivalry, has caused a lot of stress for Washington. And you don't see that as nearly as sincere in Jefferson's letter as you do here. And I think that's very telling that, whether it's Hamilton, kissing up to Washington is a term he is using, or taking the high road, I think, he's trying to remember, he's trying to, be the bigger person in this conversation. The other reason why I think it's important is the timing. September 9th, 1792 is only a couple months prior to the next election. And given the fact that from the very beginning, Washington was very apprehensive about running for a second term, I think it puts a lot into perspective here about the fact that Hamilton probably doesn't want to scare Washington out of a second term. And so I'm going to pivot away from the letter and take a look at this electoral map here. Okay. So here we have 1792. So Washington had no intentions, I will just tell you right now, had no intentions of running for a second term. And basically, it's been said largely that because of Hamilton's influence in convincing Washington to run for a second term, he does reluctantly. And the reason is because Hamilton's message to Washington is, we have not laid a solid ground yet in 4 years. We need a stable foundation, and that can't happen if you leave, because the next president in line is going to be someone other than Washington, obviously, if that happens. And it could be Thomas Jefferson, it could be John Adams, it could be somebody else. And that person may not be as beloved or supported as Washington. Okay, remember, whenever Washington decides to step down, the next president in line is going to have a tremendously difficult challenge ahead of trying to live up to fill the shoes or live up to the expectations that people had when Washington was president. Okay. So when looking at this map here, there's a couple things that you should notice. You may not remember or not, but The last election we looked at, 1789, we had 3 states that had no electoral votes because of various reasons. But in this election, all the states have ratified the Constitution, figured out their electors, and they're all voting. Okay. And so this is, hang on just a second. I see somebody had a hand raised. Sinead, just a question, or just a second. This is the first election where every single eligible state is going to be able to vote. Yes, go ahead with your question.
Is there a possibility that Hamilton wanted Washington to stay because he knew that Washington would probably side with him in cabinet more than other presidents would?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think absolutely. Because Hamilton envisions a plan that's going to have a strong central government. And if someone as popular as Jefferson gets elected, Hamilton's plans are going to come crashing down. So I think that's an excellent question, because in a lot of ways, even though he may not express it publicly, Hamilton does definitely probably have an ulterior motive to make sure that the policies of the Federalist Party are going to go into effect. So yes, that's a good point. So in 1792, we have our territories here. A couple things that have been different here. First of all, Kentucky has been added as the 14th state. That's in 1792. Shortly after this, in 1795, Tennessee, which at this time was designated as a separate territory, will shortly become a state in 3 years. You can see Georgia's boundary still kind of looks different. Its boundary today is more or less right here, but it's extended its claims to land all the way to the Mississippi River. And that was really due to the fact that the trend that we have going on is westward expansion. We have lots of people living in the Indiana Territory of the Old Northwest. Kentucky obviously became a state. Tennessee is going to become a state very quickly. And so we see the population growing, but also moving westward because of land. It took originally, under the U.S. Constitution, 60,000 people living in a territory to apply for statehood. And just in the next, 10 to 15 years, we're going to have other states added. We're going to have Tennessee added, Ohio, and then shortly after that, Mississippi and Alabama. Indiana's in 1816. So our country is growing, and it's moving west to find land because it knows that it doesn't have to be isolated along the coast because of the access to the Mississippi River, the Ohio River. It's allowing movement to take place. But that's a big theme here. But obviously, the biggest thing here is that Washington, again, for a second time, wins unanimously. Okay, Washington could have had just a so-so first term and still would have been reelected probably unanimously. And here's the crazy thing. If Washington had been younger, if Washington had more aspiration to be president, he very well may have been able to serve a third, a fourth, or fifth term. It's very possible. And part of that is, really, all that is the fact that he is the first president and he is such a beloved figure. If it had been anybody else in any other circumstance, it probably wouldn't have worked out. But I think, given the fact that Washington's only going to serve 2 terms, that's going to be very important. That's something we're going to talk about a little bit later. So, Verl, go ahead.
Do you think it would have been possible for Washington if he was willing to give himself more power than just president?
In what way?
There's a lot of talk about Washington crowning himself as an emperor.
Well, I would say that Washington definitely liked the idea of the power that he possessed, but I think from everything I've read, as a primary and a secondary source, still respected the sphere of influence that the Constitution had. One of the things that, and it kind of may seem redundant, is that Washington dismissed these titles that were thrown out for him that would have been much more aristocratic instead of going with Mr. President. There's all these kinds of really long-winded suggestions for titles of nobility that he dismissed. And I think that, along the lines of the fact that he understood that, and really in many ways didn't understand his full role as president, but also knew that he was bound and determined to follow the Constitution, that I think that if he did have these aspirations that went above and beyond what his role was, he probably didn't make them public. But I think that's a good question to ask, because I think Washington also, even though he may have been naive about his role, also knew that he was going to be able to use his status for his advantage, given the fact that he was such a beloved, respected figure. So when it comes to Washington's challenges during his presidency, I mean, obviously the debt issue that we've talked about is a big part of that. But one of the things that I think we can't overlook is what's going to happen in 1791 in terms of a domestic situation, because we don't have to worry about a war on American soil. We don't have to worry about an invasion. Britain is not going to be turning its attention to us anytime soon. So really, it's about, can the president enforce domestic policies within the border of the United States? And the greatest test that we see with that is going to be what's called the Whiskey Rebellion. Okay. And we know that Hamilton had laid out this plan to make money to pay off the war debt. Okay. And the easiest way to do that is to tax something, and to tax something that hasn't really been taxed before. And so spirits, as they're called, alcoholic beverages or spirits, began to be the target of the federal government, because if you were a farmer and you produced or some kind of grain and you had excess grain available, you could use that grain to make whiskey. Okay. And because whiskey or other spirits were not really being taxed, you were pretty much able to keep 100% of your profit, you know, after your costs. Okay. So you had you netted so much, which would be your full amount that you receive after you take out your costs. And so farmers, and we're talking like middle, lower class farmers. We're not talking about the elite plantation owners. Plantation owners didn't really need to do this. They were making a little bit on the side until the federal government under Hamilton's proposal created legislation that says we're going to start taxing whiskey in 1791. Now, the problem with this was that obviously farmers who don't like change, or anybody in America who doesn't like change, are not going to be happy with this. And so revolts and rebellions and resistance to the law happened in multiple states. This event centers so much on the state of Pennsylvania, but I can tell you there's rebellion to this law in numerous states: New York, Virginia, Georgia, New Hampshire, tons of states. And like anything, when people want to show defiance to government, they're not going to pay a tax. And what happened is, and this is so ironic, we saw American citizens and farmers began to retaliate towards the very people that were responsible for collecting the taxes, the tax collectors. And lo and behold, tax collectors were harassed, they were intimidated, they were threatened, they were tarred and feathered, they had their homes broken into. And here we have a very eerily similar situation that took place during the American Revolution. The only exception is two things. Number one, we're talking about American citizens going after fellow American citizens. And two, we're talking about laws being made here in the United States versus that in Britain. And another thing that's so ironic is that a lot of these rebellious farmers began to use the slogan, "No taxation without representation," for this scenario, which clearly doesn't work, because the laws are being made by the elected leaders of their states that represent them. This is not a circumstance where they don't have a voice or there's no representation. And so really they're just trying to cling to anything that they feel will, get more people to buy into this. And so what happens is violence does break out in various places, but more importantly, it's concentrated in Western Pennsylvania near the city of Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh is also a very important trade city, because that's where the Ohio River more or less begins. If you've ever been to Pennsylvania, to call the city of three rivers, because that's where three major river systems begin, end, or form. And that's where the Ohio River begins to take you to the Mississippi. And so what happens is Washington is not forthcoming right away in the use of force. And so he sends this peace envoy to discuss with the rebellious leaders, several hundred in Pittsburgh, to stop the rebellion. And they refuse. And so Washington, at the advice of Alexander Hamilton, decides to use force. And he has, under this law that's called the Militia Law of 1792, he has this ability to round up a militia of 12,000 men from various states surrounding Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is where the capital is now. And he's going to lead them. Washington, accustomed to commanding, is going to get on horseback and lead 12,000 men to Pittsburgh. Now, I can't imagine President Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Donald Trump. I can't imagine any of them, or really any president in history, getting on horseback and leading a militia. But somehow it seems just so much more appropriate. And I know it's the timing with technology and all that kind of stuff, and Washington. But it just seems so appropriate for Washington to do this. So Washington leads the men to Pennsylvania, to Western Pennsylvania, and the rebellion breaks up. There's no gunshots, no firing. There's about 20 men arrested, 2 of which are tried and convicted for treason, but Washington will later pardon them. But just the show of force by the president is all it needs to get the rebellion to break up. Now, this is significant. This is significant because we have seen in other rebellions in the past, the federal government unable to do anything. Shays Rebellion, which happened in 1786, farmers getting kicked off their land in Massachusetts, arming themselves and stopping the courts from issuing, these removal of people from their land. Federal government's like, we can't do anything. We have no power. This is a major change because now the federal government has the power to enforce laws that they create when they couldn't do it before. And we've seen that. Now, this is one of those examples where Jefferson is just mortified. He says he doesn't understand how the president could be leading a militia against other Americans. And he even goes on to say later that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. And I'm paraphrasing what he's saying, but he basically criticized the whole use of force by Washington and the militia. But it's a very important thing to note that armed protests were not going to be accepted, and the federal government can enforce its laws. And it's proven really for the first time in a popular, well-known example to discuss, okay? So if you think about it, Washington does not have a lot of major highlights during his presidency. I mean, everything that he does, we know, is a first. Everything that he's going to do is going to be considered to be the first of something. But Washington's presidency is going to be defined more so by his departure. Okay? And that's something that we're going to focus on more the rest of this week, because we're going to look at a good portion of Washington's farewell address, which in its entirety is 11 pages long. And no, we're not, but I will tell you, in years past we have. But given the circumstances that we're in, we are going to be reading something that's a little bit more abridged or an excerpt. But we are going to need to focus on why does Washington leave after 2 terms, and what are the 2 to 3 main concerns or warnings that he presents to the presidents and the country as a whole moving forward. Because Washington officially leaves office in 1797 with the inauguration of the new president. And unfortunately, Washington's dead less than 2 years later. So he didn't have much time to enjoy retirement or to see the country through the eyes of a different presidency. So let's talk about today's exit ticket. Again, folks, I'm looking at exit tickets for verification of attendance. There are 2 questions there that you are going to be answering for today. Why was it important for Washington to run for a second term as president? And why was it important for the U.S. to be able to enforce the tax on whiskey? Okay, those are the 2 questions that you're going to be focusing on for your exit ticket. And you can go ahead and sign off for the meeting and go ahead and work on that. If you have not completed the speech, have not completed the Hamilton Jefferson letters assignment, please do so as soon as possible. And I will see you tomorrow. If anything changes in terms of our status, I will send a message out to you all to make you aware of what's going on. Thank you.